Secret of the Lost Empire, Chapter 2. Legend of the Lost Falls. Tropical downpours drive man, beast, and insect to instant cover. They commence explosively, and little escapes their saturating attention. Only a roof thatched with layers of palm fronds interlaced with tough ribbons of straw can offer adequate protection. Even then, unless troughs have been dug around the bamboo walls, water will invariably stream across the floor. In one of the larger huts, the visitors sat talking and smoking. The atmosphere was blue with smoke from tobacco and maize leaf, and light from sputtering oil pots cast flickering shadows across the faces of the occupants. The heat was oppressive, and the strangers continually wiped their brows with their handkerchiefs. Fortunately, there were no mosquitoes, which are seldom found in Blackwater country. Although the conversation was friendly and full of compliments for Atura's hospitality, Howard sensed an ominous note in the presence of the two strangers. The man was massive. He was in his 50s, and Plum was his name. He had small yellowish eyes and thin lips which, when parted in a smile, revealed the glitter of gold-capped teeth. Skin as soft and pink as a baby's stretched over an enormous face and fell in a broad fold at his neck. His speech was slow and asthmatic. Seated next to him was Maria de Cata, a tall, slender Brazilian woman in her late 20s with jet black hair that swept straight back from her forehead. She wore jeans and a light blue shirt with a red scarf wrapped around her neck. The intense look in her dark almond eyes convinced Howard that she and Plum had not simply happened to drop by their village. John, unaware of the subtle undercurrent, asked, "Are you going to do some hunting, Mr. Plum?" The fat man smiled. "Hunting, you say?" "Yes, young man, we intend to do some hunting." "You might call it that," put in Maria. She produced a package of small oval-shaped cigarillos and, selecting one, allowed Howard to light it. "I'm afraid you've come to the wrong district," said Howard, shaking his head. "Very poor hunting around here." Plum's face appeared to darken. "Now, I'm indeed sorry to hear that, Mr. Sky. I should have thought this region would be literally teeming with game. A disappointment, sir, a disappointment. What do you suggest, Mr. Cata?" Maria ran a forefinger along her lip line, found an invisible speck and removed it. "We'll have to head back down the Tuki to the Amazon and go farther west, I suppose." She paused and looked directly at Howard. "Strange. I thought we would find what we wanted right here." Howard held her gaze for a long moment, then turned to Plum. "I'm curious to know how you happened to find us," he said. "It does seem strange," added John. "No maps even show the Tuki River, let alone this village." "Not so strange," sighed Plum, mopping heavy beads of sweat from his brow. You explain it to them, Mr. Cata." "As has already been suggested, Mr. Sky, this is a combined hunting and pleasure expedition. We hope to bag a few jaguar and perhaps take some live anacondas back to Rio de Janeiro, if we can find good specimens." 8 meters long?" teased John. 10, if possible. She cast a faint smile toward the boy. "Mr. Plum here intends to film the Indian tribes and also collect flora and fauna for an institute he has connections with in North America. You might sum it up, Mr. Sky, by saying our purposes are," she glanced casually at Plum, then back, "scientific." There was a pause while Howard translated Maria's speech to an intent Atura, who sat bobbing his head solemnly with each word. "We inquired at the university in Manaus and were advised to come here. We engaged porters and purchased the necessary boats and supplies in that city, and we've been traveling for 3 weeks. We would have flown. I'm a licensed pilot, Mr. Sky, but we were told the Tuki was too narrow and twisted too much." Maria dabbed her moist cheeks with her scarf and tossed her cigarillo into the fire. "You've made excellent time," said Howard. "We're a long way from Manaus." "I should think we're very close to the headwater country," stated Plum. "It's still quite a distance," replied Howard. "But tell me, who suggested you come to this particular village?" "One of the officials at the university." Maria turned to Plum. "Do you remember his name?" "No, but it doesn't really matter. Quite unimportant, I assure you." "I'm curious," continued Howard, with a gray glint in his eyes, which John instantly recognized. There would be no stopping him until he had a satisfactory answer. The official you speak of must have considerable knowledge of this territory to suggest the Tuki and this particular Jacama village. As John has said, you'll find them on no map. Come to think of it, Mr. Skye, the fellow did appear knowledgeable. Wouldn't you say so, Miss Takata? Oh, yes, agreed Maria. Then, Howard went on, why was he so certain we were stocked with anaconda and jaguar, when the truth of the matter is you won't find specimens of either within 100 kilometers? Well, Plum began, but he was interrupted by Maria. Actually, Mr. Skye, the official thought you might be willing to guide us to what we're after. Her face betrayed no emotion. Plum nodded in agreement. He said no one knew this country quite as well as you do. Howard's eyes narrowed, and his fingers stroked his beard. He actually mentioned my name, Miss Takata? Yes, and what? He said if we couldn't find you, we might try to locate the one other man who is as well informed about this territory. His name? Howard felt his pulse quicken. I'm so forgetful, Mr. Skye. She turned once again to Plum. What did he say his name was? Plum recommenced mopping his face. Tanner, I believe he said. Yes, Amos Tanner. A sudden shock coursed through Howard, and an expression of total incredulity flashed across his face. Then, as though to underline the mixture of tension and wonder that filled him at the mention of that name, a clap of thunder rolled beyond the walls. The flames from the oil pots cast bizarre, wavering shadows over the faces of those around him. Amos Tanner. The following morning, when Plum emerged from his quarters, he blinked his eyes at a scene of great activity. 5 of the huts had been severely damaged during the night, and reconstruction was now in progress. Some Indians were carrying bunches of long-shaved willow wands, which were being used to form domed, skeleton-like frameworks. Others were manipulating palm sheaves, weaving the tough fibers with straw through the willow latticework to repair the walls and roofing. A yellow Amazonian sun flared down on the glistening bodies and put everything in such bright relief that Plum's eyes required minutes to adjust, and by the time he was able to bring them to a squinting focus, his flabby cheeks and jowls were oozing steady streams of sweat, which reduced his shirt to a wet rag. He commented on the heat to Howard, who stood in the shadow of the giant silken cotton tree. He was sketching the reconstruction of the wrecked huts with a piece of charcoal. As they say, replied Howard, not looking up from his easel, it goes with the life out here. One has to get used to it. Plum leaned against one of the tree buttresses and studied the artist for a long time before speaking. I didn't know you painted, Mr. Skye. How interesting. Oh, replied Howard offhandedly, I suspect you knew. In fact, Mr. Plum, when you mentioned Tanner's name, it was clear that you knew a great deal about John and me, who we are, why we're here. John's father, all the rest of it. If you continue to be as evasive as you've been up to now, there's little point in further discussion. Plum smiled and waddled off across the compound. A feast in tribute to the gods for the end of the storm and the restoration of the huts commenced shortly after sundown. It began with chants of praise and evolved into feverish dancing around a crescent of fires blazing in the dark night. Toward midnight, Plum began to show signs of impatience and suggested to Howard that they retire to his hut for a serious discussion. Howard advised sleep for John, who, despite the good time he was having, got up and went to his quarters without argument. Such obedience struck his uncle as curious, but he thought no more about it. At Howard's suggestion, Plum and Maria paid their respects to Atura, then the 3 disappeared into Plum's hut on the other side of the village. The chanting of the Indians ebbed and flowed as the hard wood drums beat a steady rhythm. Plum applied a match to his cigar. Now, Mr. Skye, suppose we get down to business. That suits me fine, said the bearded man. I suggest we start where we left off, with Amos Tanner. Agreed, Plum spoke with assurance. Mr. Skye, we want you to lead us to this man. We have reason to believe you are the only person he's kept contact with through the years since your brother was declared lost and dead. Correct so far? Keep going. We have further reason to believe that he possesses information vital to our purposes, information gleaned from having accompanied your brother, Christopher Skye, on some of his last expeditions. I am referring to an old manuscript originally given to your brother by Jose Garcia of the University of Manaus. Howard's eyes brightened in the shadowed room. Ah, then it was Garcia who sent you here. I thought as much, but how can you be certain Tanner has the manuscript? He made reference to that very important document in one of the articles he wrote for a North American newspaper while he was trying to find your brother. Surely you've seen the manuscript. Howard stared at the oil flame a long time before speaking. His eyes held a look Plum had noted earlier, a look of years and matters he did not wish to speak about. When at last he broke from his reverie, he said, "No, I've never seen it, nor have I had much desire to. I've never accepted the legend or the dream Chris always held. As for Tanner, he too became infected with the obsession." His eyes came up from the flame and leveled directly at Plum. "We are talking about the same thing, aren't we? It is the Falls of Oriana you're after?" Plum beamed. "It is, Mr. Sky, and more than that. Naturally, we would like to gaze upon that remarkable waterfall. If the legend is true, it falls freely for over 1.5 kilometers, and thus would unquestionably be the highest of its kind in the world. Much higher even than Angel Falls in Venezuela. Yes, it would be something to see. But alas, Mr. Sky, we are more practical than your brother, or Amos Tanner. They wanted to be the first to see the falls. We are interested in what lies above the falls." "The lost city of the Incas? The gold of the Incan Empire?" "Yes, the gold." Howard Sky slowly shook his head from side to side and laughed freely and loudly. "But it's a myth!" he half shouted. "There's no waterfall, no lost city, no empire, no gold. It's all a crazy superstitious legend. Chris wasted years and finally lost his life chasing that rainbow. It destroyed him as it is slowly destroying Amos Tanner, as it will just as surely consume you if you keep after it. There has never been a tangible piece of evidence that the falls exist." "But that manuscript," Plum interposed. "Jose Garcia told us it contained a summary of the writings of a mad, fever-stricken soldier in the service of Francisco de Orellana in the 16th century, Howard finished. "My brother told me the whole story many times. Apparently, the fellow had been lost without supplies for weeks when they found him. He was delirious and later turned out to be quite mad." Maria broke in. "Then why did your brother persist in trying to prove the legend true?" "Any of the writings of Amos Tanner will tell you that. Chris was in love, Miss Takata, with a dream he was determined to achieve no matter what the cost. He was an idealist and the most obsessed man I have ever known. The Falls of Oriana, as the legendary falls were named, became something he had to find despite any consequences to himself or those around him. Once his mind became infected with the dream of being the first man to find the highest waterfall on earth, nothing would stop him. He was like someone gone mad, and in the end, he disappeared completely." "A man destroyed by a beautiful dream," Maria whispered. "One draws a curious moral from your tale, Mr. Sky." "Then," Howard said, "you can understand my views on the subject." "On the contrary, Mr. Sky," commented Plum, "philosophy is of little concern to me, but I do understand one thing quite clearly now." Howard was silent. "I understand why you didn't invite John to join us this evening, why you dispatched him to bed. You're afraid that he might become interested in the legend and his father's beliefs, and that he too might become infected." Howard said nothing. His silence confirmed Plum's opinion. He might in fact even develop the notion that his father has found his lost world and is still alive. Then there would be no stopping him, would there? "Possibly," said Howard. "He believes that now. More and more he asks me about Chris. But you diplomatically stamp out his questions, quell his curiosity, don't you? You don't believe there's a shred of possibility that his father may still be alive, and your concern is that the boy will either lose his life or waste it in vain pursuit. After the many search parties, and I've been on every one of them, and the many years, some evidence would surely have turned up." He paused. "Mr. Plum, there has never been so much as a rumor. If there had been, I would never have let it go unchecked." "Miss Takata and I can well believe that, Mr. Sky. We appreciate your views on obsessiveness and fruitless hope, but—" "But what?" asked Howard. "But we do not share your disbelief in the existence of the falls and the gold of the Incas. I, too, am confident that Christopher Sky is dead, but I have a fairly strong reason for believing that what he was looking for actually exists. Some new evidence came to light not too long ago. I'll go into it later, once you've signified your intentions, and that is why we have taken up the treasure hunt. And you need the help of Amos Tanner." Exactly. Let me put it this way. We're certain he holds information which, when coupled with what we have, will lead us not only to the legendary falls, but to an undreamt of fortune on the plateau above them. If Tanner joins us, he will find his dream come true. He'll also be rich. So will you for helping us. So will we all. Howard began to stuff maize-leaf tobacco into his pipe. How reliable is this new evidence you speak of? I should say about 75%. It's still a gamble, of course, but sound enough to intrigue my practical imagination. I don't strike you as a harebrained dreamer, do I? Quite to the contrary, actually. What do you say, Mr. Skye? Will you join our merry trek? Howard rose, lighting his pipe, and walked to the hut entrance where light from the fires strung across the village compound flashed against his face. He turned toward the two, his body silhouetted against the bright archway. I have spent 15 years of my life in the shadow of an impossible legend that has meant nothing but frustration, hardship, and death. I have listened to my brother talk endlessly about this time it's a sure thing, and I have slowly watched the decay of Amos Tanner. You must realize that it is not easy for me to become enthusiastic. Maria spoke. Perhaps you could tell us where Amos Tanner is, if you don't want to come with us. That's all we really want to know. That's hardly a realistic approach, Miss Takata, interjected Plum with his customary wheeze. If finding Tanner were that simple, I'm confident Mr. Skye would have told us earlier and sent us on our way. He looked at the bearded painter. Am I not right, sir? Howard came back and stood before them. You're quite right. Tanner has been wandering ever since Chris disappeared. He shows up here every year or so. He might be at one of the dozen outposts on the Marinon or Ucayali or even the Yavari. I'd have to be with you to check and follow up traces. I know the country. I'm sure we'd locate him, but it would take time. Well then, Mr. Skye, your decision? Let me answer you with a question. You know how pointless and futile I believe all this will be. Where do I stand should I choose not to accompany you? Plum eased his massive body out of the bamboo chair and came up close to Howard. Do you want me to be blunt or beat around the bush? Be blunt. Plum sighed. Very well then, but you force me to employ melodramatics, which I find loathsome and, if I may say so, tedious. He straightened his rumpled jacket and smoothed the lapels with his pudgy fingers. Any number of alternatives would be open to me, considering that I am a man who is not without influence and connections. He glared suddenly at Howard. Atura means much to you. The whole Jacama tribe means much to you. Is that not so, Mr. Skye? He did not wait for an answer. Of course they do. They are part of your life. Well, Mr. Skye, suppose an outbreak of smallpox should suddenly occur among the Jacamas. That would be quite devastating, wouldn't it? And it would all appear so natural, no guilt to lay at anyone's doorstep. Howard's face blanched in disbelief. He did not attempt to speak, but only glowered bleakly at the fat man. Misfortunes like that are not hard to arrange, particularly when one has served as a consultant on how to deal with troublesome tribes and has a friend who is a bacteriologist. I should think a small test tube of smallpox bacteria would go a long way down here, and I could arrange for pretty speedy delivery if necessary. The fat man smiled again. That's one alternative. There are others. Would you like me to draw them to your attention? Howard slowly sank into his chair. However, Plum went on, should you go along with our plan, the Jacamas can continue to live out their days in happy innocence. No harm will come to them, and your secret will be safe. The boy need never know what we are up to. He can remain here in the belief that you've taken off for a few weeks to escort us to, he smiled, happier hunting grounds. You leave me no alternative, whispered Howard. Now, Plum sat down, placing his hand on the artist's shoulder. I don't wish matters to be put on that basis. After all, you're going to be a very wealthy man. You should be indebted to me for my invitation. Suddenly, a heavy shh came from Maria. Plum jerked his head around and Howard sprang to his feet. Shh, repeated Maria. Listen. The three remained motionless, their ears straining for the slightest sound. What is it? Whispered Plum hoarsely. Listen. The drums and the chanting had temporarily ebbed, Behind them, a faint creaking noise could be detected, almost as though someone were leaning against the hut. Plum nodded to Maria in the direction of the door. She snatched up her rifle and disappeared outside. The remaining two waited without movement. At last, Maria's slim figure ducked back in through the entrance. "No one there," she announced. "Well, there was someone there," said Howard. Plum nodded. "The jungle's pretty thick behind the hut. It could have been an Indian wondering what we've been up to. Anyway, they don't understand English, do they, Mr. Sky?" "No." "In that case," continued Plum, "I suggest we conclude our little meeting and retire. We have busy days ahead arranging with Atura for additional porters and getting our supplies and canoes in order. I suspect he'll be cooperative. Wouldn't you say so, Mr. Sky?" Howard spoke disconsolately. "He'll do as I ask." "You sound so depressed," wheezed Mr. Plum. "To listen to you, one would think was the end of everything instead of the beginning." "I wonder," said Howard.